Good morning. It's 6:11, Monday, first day of June 2020, and it's freezing outside. Yes, I found ice this morning. Well, here we are. It's what God has ordained, and we'll make the best of it, right? Good to see you this morning. Hope it was a good weekend. I know it was for us at Websterville. We were able to do in-person meetings again and try to maintain the guidelines that the state gave for us. Overall, we had good numbers in both services, so that between the two services, nearly 75% of what normally would have been there in one service was able to be in person again. So we're grateful for that, and we're trusting God for His goodness and mercy through that process, and we're excited about that. Hey, we're getting into the details of the misery that's going to come upon Jeremiah. So we're going to be looking this week with the intention to kind of wrap it up this week. We're going to look at Jeremiah's dilemma. We're going to look at Judah's demise, and then we're going to look at Zedekiah's death. And to get things rolling, let's talk about where we are in Jeremiah chapter 37, and particularly where Jeremiah is in Jeremiah chapter 37, and that's going to set the basis for where we go today, all right? So we're going to Jeremiah chapter 37. I want you to note, let's set the stage. And King Zedekiah is of the son of Josiah, reigned instead of Coniah the son of Jehoiakim, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, made him king in the land of Judah. But, and again, remember, we've talked about these grammar pieces. This conjunction, but, tells us an awful lot about what is to happen here. Neither he nor his servants, then notice, nor the people of the land did hearken unto the words of the Lord, which he spake by the prophet Jeremiah. Now, we can only go to one thing. Whenever a people do not heed the will and the way of God, what's going to happen? Destruction, right? And I have this temptation with all the rioting that's going on in the major cities of our country to say, I wonder if this is not indeed God's verdict on these cities, because they have continued to reject the truth. Now, I don't have any basis. There was no prophet like Jeremiah saying this was what's going to happen in Minneapolis, this is what was going to happen in Washington, D.C., this is what was going to happen in Philadelphia, Seattle, Los Angeles. You get where I'm going. But when you start to look at these things, and you still believe in the sovereignty of God, we can come up with this one conclusion. Something good can come out of this. So Romans 8:28 tells us, for all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. And we're hoping that there'll be some resonating voices in these cities that have been destroyed, and neighborhoods have been destroyed, that now will be the calm, that now will present the gospel, that now people will get saved. Now people will look at the ugliness of what just took place and say there must be another answer. And we'll never hear that in Washington Post, and we'll never hear that on CNN. But I'm catching glimpses of people trying to do godly things in the midst of this. And in heaven, we'll see those videos, okay? So let's never forget, God's at work even when it doesn't look like he is. And he is here in this story too, okay? So we have this, what ends up going on here. So Jeremiah 37, and Zedekiah sent Jehoiakim the son of Shemaiah and Zephaniah the son of Maaseiah the priest to the prophet Jeremiah, saying, pray now unto the Lord our God for us. How ironic, and I've seen this. Now this I can speak from some authority, having been in it. When you're in the public sector, they don't have answers. They try. They really do try hard. There are some really good, hardworking people in these public sectors. But if you're not on the right side of Proverbs 1:7 or Proverbs 9:10, which is the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the holy is understanding. They're always running into walls. It never succeeds the way they hoped. So that's what's happening with Zedekiah. It's not working out. So you know what? Perchance Jeremiah does hear from God. Let's go send messengers and ask Jeremiah to pray for us. We know God's with him. Do you see the ludicrousy of the way people think and what's coming out of this story? Zedekiah has rejected God. The people have rejected God. Nothing's working. Everything's collapsing. Maybe we could try Jeremiah again. Maybe he'll be kind to us. Okay, let's see what happens. So now Jeremiah came in and out among the people, for they had put him into prison. All right? And here's what he says. He doesn't change the message. Then came the word of the Lord unto the prophet Jeremiah, saying, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Thus shall you say to the king of Judah, that sent you into me to inquire of me, Behold, Pharaoh's army, which is one forth to help you, shall return to Egypt unto their own, and the Chaldeans shall come again and fight against the city and take it and burn it with fire. This hasn't changed. And he basically goes, remember we talked about it the other day. He said, here's it is. If you go out and you humble yourself before the Chaldees, you shall live. But if you stay in here, the city is going to be burnt with fire. So, they don't like that answer. So here's what happens with Jeremiah. They keep, like I said, they keep putting him in prison. They take him out of prison. Then they make it worse for him. So now we go to verse 21 just to show where he's at again. So Zedekiah didn't like the message and says, Zedekiah the king commanded that they should commit Jeremiah into the court of the prison, that they should give him daily a piece of bread out of the baker's street until the bread in the city were spent. Thus Jeremiah remained in the court of the prison. So he's gone deeper into the prison. Okay. Now see where it goes when we go into chapter 38. So now, then these guys get word of what Jeremiah has said. Now notice this guy here. We have this guy here, Gedaliah, the son of Fecher. Remember him? We've seen him before. And they were angry about what Jeremiah had spoken. And so they decide to go to Zedekiah, and they tell the princes. And then Zedekiah says in verse number 5 of chapter 38, Behold, he is in your hand, for the king is not he that can do anything against you. Then took they Jeremiah and cast him into, what does it say? The dungeon of Malachiah, the son of Ahimelech, that was in the court of the prison. They let down Jeremiah with cords, and in the dungeon there was no water, but mire. So Jeremiah sunk in the mire. It's getting worse, not better. Now, we cannot understand the sovereignty of God, but we can understand his grace. Okay? Things are going to be bad in this world because of sin, and because there are spiritual warfare going on, and we know that things are plotting and trotting to the end, and that the end is going to be worse. It's called perilous times. There is a dark force. There's a deep state. There is a mini antichrist, and there is the antichrist that ultimately are going to come to the stage. They've been working in the shadows, in the back rooms for decades, if not centuries, to bring about what is about to happen. So it's going to get bad. We may experience it, we may not. That's up to God. But this I know. Jeremiah, when we look at Jeremiah in the pit, he has God's grace. Let's talk about that just a little bit. Let's talk about God's grace. But to do so, let's talk about the pit. Let's talk about the pit. So I just ran my trusty e-sword here, and I ran the word pit. And I decided to limit it to just looking in the books of wisdom, which would be the books of poetry, Job and Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. I specifically like the way David and others write about the pit. And we're going to look at particularly Psalm 35:7. Notice how the pit, the experience of the pit, affects my soul. For without cause have they hid from me their net in a pit, which without cause they have digged for my soul. This, even though you may not physically go into a pit like Jeremiah, metaphorically, we all experience the pit. In fact, the pit is there also for the wicked. Everyone's going to go into the pit. The difference is, I have God's grace. Those that do not have God don't have God's grace in the pit. Okay? So this is what we want to focus on, that no matter what comes, God's grace is always sufficient. Let's look at a few other verses. So we see in chapter 40 here, let me get it so where it's not glaring too much. Psalm 40, he says, He brought me up also out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and set my feet upon a rock and established my goings. Every time I read that verse, it always reminds me of Jeremiah here, and Jeremiah's needing of grace. Now, that verse lives out, because here's what I'm talking about. Jeremiah is in the lowest part of the prison. They have come for his soul. And remember, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers of the air. There is a demonic pressure on Jeremiah right now. He is being attacked. But God's grace is always sufficient. It'll come to the place where we feel we can take no more. And then God always brings some help, some way, somehow. Notice how this help comes in Jeremiah 38. So, we're now in verse number 7. Jeremiah is in the mire. And it says, Now when Ebed-melech, the Ethiopian, one of the eunuchs. Let me just say, he's a eunuch. He's Ethiopian. He's a slave. Now, I'm not going to go too far with this, because I know we're in a hot day right now with all that's taking place out in Minneapolis. But he's a black man. And he's a slave. And he's been mistreated. But he's going to make a choice. And it's the right choice. Notice what he does. So, one of the eunuchs was in the king's house, heard that they had put Jeremiah in the dungeon, and the king was sitting in the gate of Benjamin. And Ebed-melech went forth out of the king's house, and spake to the king, saying, My lord the king, these men have done evil in all that they have done to Jeremiah the prophet, whom they have cast into the dungeon, and he is like to die for hunger in the place where he is, for there is no more bread in the city. Then the king commanded Ebed-melech the Ethiopian, saying, Take from thence 30 men with thee, and take up Jeremiah the prophet out of the dungeon before he die. And so Ebed-melech took the men with him, and went into the house of the king under the treasury, and took thence old cast cloths and old rotten rags, and let them down by cords into the dungeon to Jeremiah. And Ebed-melech the Ethiopian said unto Jeremiah, Put now these old cast cloths, rotten rags, under thine armpits, under the cords. And Jeremiah did so, and they drew him up with the cords, and took him up out of the dungeon, and Jeremiah remained in the court of the prison. God's grace. God's grace. God took a man who had been misused in slavery, and used a man to go and help someone that was in a worse condition. Didn't go to make it worse for him. Used that man who had been in that condition and went and did what was right. How does that happen? Because every one of us are going to have pit experiences. Every one of us are going to be mistreated. Every one of us are going to experience things that are just not good in life. Could I just suggest, how about we use it for compassion rather than we use it for bitterness and anger, and then take it out on the innocent? This Ethiopian, this black man, felt the pain Jeremiah was in. And out of that, his heart was for Jeremiah. And he wanted to be used to help Jeremiah. And he used courage to go to Zedekiah and say, look, Jeremiah has been so mistreated. Can we do something? And Zedekiah, by God's grace, says, yeah, go do something. Get him out of there. And so he's brought out of that miry clay and set upon a solid rock. What a beautiful picture of what God does when we end up in those pits and our soul is vanquishing and we don't know what to do. Could I just suggest to you, God's grace is on its way. God's grace is on its way. We will not be tempted past that which we're able to watch. We will that which we're able to bear. We will always have God's grace is sufficient. He loves us beyond measure. So never give up. God has it. Go with God today. He's worth it. Let God go with you, and it will be a blessing. Good day.